Luminary presents Therapy versus the World. I'm your host, Joe Nucci, and today I'm very, very excited to share this conversation I had with Jake Ernst. Jake is a speaker, writer, clinical social worker, psychotherapist, and clinical director at a group practice. In this episode, we talk about social media, algorithms, technology, and the complex dynamics of technology and digital media has with our mental health, with our societies, and with the different systems of our world. I was actually very, very surprised at how much I learned from Jake, and I'm very, very excited to share some of that knowledge with all of you. Please enjoy. Welcome, Jake. I'm really excited to talk to you.
I am super excited to be here, Joe. It's great to be here.
What I first wanted to do is I first wanted to just hear a little bit more about you, and particularly how you became a therapist, why you became a therapist, and why content. And I'm going to share a little bit about my story as well, and then we'll kind of take it from there.
Yeah, awesome. So I actually started as a camp counselor. That sort of was the beginning process of me in my work with young people. And to this day, I still work with teens and with families. And I would say one of the biggest parts of my work is working at the intersection of teens and technology. I think those are two really important interests of mine that kind of bring me to this work. And it seems as though today I cannot escape conversations about social media, the internet, as it pertains to well-being. And so I'm seeing so many kids, so many families coming in and talking about technology. And it's pretty fascinating because I, as a content creator myself, as a writer, I do a lot of speaking on these sorts of topics that I talk about often online. And it's just so fascinating, just the ways that the online world has kind of creeped into our well-being, our relationships, and of course our psychology. So I'm super fascinated by that. And as a camp counselor, really in the early days, those were the days where I feel like it was pre-internet. It was before all of this really started to take over our lives. And so I almost feel like my work right now is a little bit of a recapturing quest to like go back to those times in the pre-internet, in the times where kids had a play-based childhood, not a phone-based one.
Tell everyone who's listening, why is play important? It's maybe obvious to you and me, but in case they don't know, what does the research say?
Yeah, play is just so important for our well-being and for our developmental trajectory, actually. So we need play in order to master our environment. And when we're young kids, we don't have the brain capacity to master our environment in ways that adults do. And so the way that we know how to do that as kids is essentially building close relationships and engaging in forms of play. And so I won't get into the various forms of play, but there are different types of play that we go through as kids in order to build our brains socially, build our brains emotionally, and then cognitively as well. So I find that there's a really big erosion of play, specifically in the category of independence and risk-taking. And I would say that it's really impacting kids' well-being. And I would actually sort of cite that as one of the major impacts of living our lives online and having a play-based childhood, a phone-based childhood rather than a play-based one. And I'm seeing the most in young people today, this sort of erosion of risk-taking and this erosion of engaging in forms of free play, and which we know that as humans, all humans, we need this. We need to be able to play.
Tell me a little bit about what you mean when you say the independence and the risk-taking is something that's part of a play-based childhood versus a phone-based childhood. Someone who doesn't understand the distinctions, and I'm certainly having this question right now in this moment, is, well, if someone is on their phone all the time, that probably makes them pretty independent. And there are ways to risk things using the internet that are actually safer. So for example, maybe if you come into puberty and you have all these thoughts and urges around sexuality, isn't it arguably safer that you do this online where you're not kind of risking any physical contact? Or what would you say to someone who's having that question?
Ooh, such great questions. I love that line of inquiry. I think that it's important for us to critically examine sort of the depths and the ins and outs kind of using social media. And I think that when I talk about independence, I really actually mean independence with a safe haven and a secure base to kind of come back to. And I think that the way that I describe it with families is when you give a child a smartphone, especially at a really young age, like middle school, in early high school, you're essentially giving them a free plane ticket anywhere in the world to travel, and without supervision and without oversight. And I think that that creates a level of freedom that is too risky, right? It's unfortunate. It's just too big for their brains to be able to handle by themselves. And so I like to think of it as unstructured free play is the form of independence that we want to inspire in kids. But I think that it's a bit too unstructured, a bit too uninhibited when they're just left to their own devices, literally or figuratively.
Absolutely. So I hear you saying that there's what people might think is independence on your phone. It could actually be something like escapism, loneliness, and they're doing it not because it's preferable to the connection you might have in person, and then you can kind of retreat back to that stable place that you were talking about, but it's actually just because it's all they know.
Exactly. I think that also when we give our lives over to an algorithm, it makes us, it sort of brings us back to that really early middle school period where we're all really socially vulnerable and really bent on wanting some social validation. And that's why I think that social media and the construction of these apps really exploits the pre-social parts of us, the ones that really do crave social validation. So the social validation features that are built into these apps and algorithms, things like likes, comments, and followers, it really does bring us back to that really vulnerable place in middle school, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking about, I interviewed Zach Gottlieb, who is a mental health and wellness influencer in Gen Z. And we were talking about his perspective on social media. And if you haven't listened to the episode, you can go or wherever you're finding this podcast and listen to it. He specifically said he believes that a lot of the problems that we're having today with the Gen Z mental health conversation are actually problems that every generation has. It's not so much that social media is a problem. It's, well, why is it a problem? And it touched on some of the things that you exactly said, which is, well, if people post that they're hanging out and I wasn't invited, even though I know it's cool, I have that thought, well, maybe it's not cool. And that happens constantly when you're on your feed. And, you know, my version of that growing up was, oh, if you didn't get invited to the birthday party, you know, it still didn't feel good, but it wasn't necessarily a constant risk. Is there something about the continuous exposure to those different like risk factors, you can almost think of them, that really concerns you?
Yeah, for sure. First, I do want to say Zach Gottlieb, I think he's just doing such important work. And so I'm really happy to hear that you spoke to him. He is such a leader, I think, for Gen Z in having these conversations. And so shout out to Zach, super great work. In addition to that, I have a personal theory. Actually, maybe I can run it by you and kind of bounce it off you and get your take on it. I have this theory that I think that social media is retraining a level of self-focus that is unhealthy for us. And I also think that it is creating a dual immersion effect, is what I call it, where we're not just living one life, but we're living two. The one that we're living online and the one that we're living in real life. And I think that our brain has a really hard time distinguishing modes of reality when we are constantly flipping back and forth between what is algorithmically the case and what is actually maybe by nature or nurture the case. And so I think that there's an overlap, and I think there's this brain scramble effect that I see our nervous systems doing. And I notice it's just really hard for us to discern. And I think that it's really training the unhealthy mental habits, disaster focus, categorical thinking, really extreme black and white polarization, that kind of thing.
Yeah, let's dive into it. It's a really, really interesting hypothesis. So the first part about self-focus, the thing that popped up, it's actually a distinction from Jordan Peterson of all people. And he's talking about the big five, and he's talking about how self-consciousness is a subtrait of neuroticism, which is sensitivity to negative emotion. And I remember in whatever, I don't know if I saw it on YouTube or like where I saw it, but I remember thinking it was such a brilliant interpretation of the literature, because what he basically took it to mean is that you focus on yourself too much, and that is going to predict all these other neurotic traits: anxiety, depression, anger, all of it. And it's one of the things that I've been trying to become intentionally aware about with myself, because I do so much work on myself. I go to therapy. I really prioritize my own self-development in order to be a better therapist. And there's this responsibility that comes with that, with like the dangers of self-reflection. Connecting it to the social media piece and this piece around self-focus, we're going to gravitate towards content that validates us, but that also lets us understand our experiences more. So if you're someone that is even mildly interested in self-reflecting from a mental health perspective or psychological perspective or family systems perspective or whatever it is, and the algorithm picks up on that, it's going to actually intensify all the distinctions that you're getting, and you're going to be thinking about yourself even more. In that video, I remember his takeaway, though, really simple and elegant, and I think it's brilliant. I've thought about it a lot since I watched it. Is that means that the way out of that is to actually focus on others and be curious about others. And I sometimes wonder, maybe one of the reasons why all of my intentionality around self-help and self-development, et cetera, hasn't necessarily led me to a more neurotic place, is because I'm turning around and I'm getting super curious about my patients. And I've been trying to do that more intentionally when I am feeling anxious or I am feeling more neurotic in the sense of feeling sensitive to negative or unpleasant emotions. I've been trying to do that with people in my life. I try to think, okay, well, is this actually something I need to be feeling right now? Or can I shift my awareness to the person in front of me and be more curious? And it's almost always regulating. And so I want to go back to the dual reality thing, but the self-focus thing is so interesting because I look at my mom's algorithm and like her suggested thing, and it's all like puppies and like babies. It's like babies doing cute things. Like those two things never come on my feed, And so the way it's a mirror and the way it kind of reflects and encourages you to look at things that you like, which I mean makes perfect sense that it would do that. It's it just kind of has me thinking about those concerts. What do you think about all of that I just said?
I think it's important for us to know the different types of algorithms in order to really have this conversation at depth. I think so. There are three main types of algorithms that these social media apps are using. So there's the social graph, there's the interest graph, and then there's the discovery graph. And I can tell you some examples to really illustrate how each of these work. So the social graph started on Facebook. Facebook is the premier kind of leading algorithm, the one that is the news feed and the one that connects you to all the people in your network. So the social graph is friends and followers and the people that you are following. And so that is where the news feed is pushing you, your social life, right? So all the people that you are following and the ones that are following you. Now, the interest graph is the one that is pushing you basically all the things that you are interested in. So it's all the things that you're engaging with. So for example, for maybe you and I, our feeds are probably more likely, our interest graph is more likely being pushed. Mental health content, maybe self-help content, maybe self-development type stuff. Then third, there's the discovery graph. The discovery graph, which is popularized by TikTok, basically just pushes a bunch of stuff at you in a discovery type format. And it sort of says, hey, do you like this? Do you like this? Well, how about this? How about this? Do you like this video? And so at a really random rate, almost like a slot machine style effect, it's going to push you all this random content and see what, from a discovery perspective, you'd be interested in. And then so Reels, of course, now uses a discovery, interest, and social graph, and Instagram. Yeah, so a lot of these apps now are all using a combination of all three of these algorithms. And so that's why they're so addictive. That's why they're so strong. It's not just one algorithm. When we talk about, the addictive nature of these algorithms, it's not just because there's one random algorithm that is controlling what you see. It's because there are three working together in tandem.
Well, definitely the discovery, the novelty triggers that circuit in the nervous system. Let's say the social maybe triggers validation, which again is kind of this other, it's distinct, at least that's my understanding of the neuroscience. And then the interest is then just yet another, but then put them all three together. And I mean, they're called users for a reason.
Truly.
It's
And
addictive.
I think the algorithm is actually meant to be a mini nervous system in our phones. That's how it works. It has all these different circuitry and all these different systems, right, that talk to each other to give us information about the environment that we're exploring or that we're trying to get to know, right?
Yeah. And so given that those distinctions around the algorithm, which I really appreciate learning, how might you upgrade, or what might you say about my comments around like the self-focus, that it's like encouraging self-focus and the implications of that might be more feeling more self-conscious and therefore more anxious, more depressed, etc.
So the combination and the use of all three of these filter algorithms together creates something called a bubble filter. And so it basically creates this little mini algorithmic life where you're just only accessing things that are connected to you as a person from a social or interest perspective, or things that you find discoverable and things that you find worthy of your focus and attention. And so it creates this bubble filter where we're basically just screaming into our in-group. We're basically just screaming at all the people who see things the way that we see them. And unfortunately, fortunately, life is not like that. Life is not just a bubble filter. And so it makes these companies a ton of money because it can capture our focus and attention. It gets eyeballs on the ads, which sell tons of ad dollars, right? And so it's important for us to remember that we should not be dictated by algorithms. And I think that I was reading this piece in the New York Times a couple weeks ago. It was talking about how living our lives according to algorithms is actually making us really boring. It's making us all so similar and so alike to our in-group that we're looking around the people around us and there's not really any diversity. There's no diversity of opinion. There's no diversity of thought, no diversity of style. And so we become off really boring to each other because we're all just big reflections of each other.
Yeah. One of the cooler distinctions, I don't know if cool is actually the right word, but a distinction I got from a social media strategist as I started getting very serious about my content creation is he said, you have to remember that popular culture is internet culture and internet culture is social media culture. And his argument was anyone who tries to argue against that is really missing the point, because sure, maybe there's a nuance to throw in here or there, but at the end of the day, that's what's happening. I'm based in New York City and I know about the cool new restaurants that open because of what gets pushed via the ads. And I just feel like it wasn't even like that. Even 5-10 years ago, you saw an ad for something on Instagram and there was almost like a distrust. It was like, oh, like they're using Instagram to advertise, like lame, like, but now it's completely different, particularly with the influencer market. You follow someone, you really, really trust them. They really love this product. Well, then you're more likely to go look at it. And so it's just interesting how quickly it's changed.
Yeah. So sort of back to that kind of distinction between self-focus and other focus. I think my main concern as a therapist is what happens when our entire lives, our relationships, our thoughts, our feelings, our moods even are dictated or perhaps determined by algorithms. I just wonder like what that life looks like when my life can be completely reshaped and changed by what I see on my phone and this black box that I hold in my hand.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're starting to see that now. I mean, we could look at it from a political perspective, a mental health perspective, a dating perspective, Truly. A social perspective. It does have touch points in all of these things. I don't want to lose the dual reality comment. Can you briefly recap what that is, and then I can give just like a little like riff on it?
So I have this theory that we are not just living one life, we are living two. And it is creating what I have self-titled this dual immersion effect, where we're living lives online and also in real life. And I think the more different that those two realities create for us, the more distress that can create in the shift back and forth. And so ideally, we want to create integration as best as possible, where the person we are online in our online spaces is the same person that we are in real life. And in my work with young people, I really see the dispersion that can get created from living in a dual immersive environment.
Yeah. Are you familiar with, so some futurists are predicting that Generation Alpha will actually be the most private generation online in response to how public and ourselves that we've been. Now, they still will engage with content. So even if they're using a persona or not posting pictures of their faces or whatever it ends up looking like, if the prediction is true, there will still be social media and content, etc. Do you see that as a further disbursement, like kind of in this dual immersion effect?
I do. There's a ton of people who are also predicting that Generation Alpha won't go to post-secondary education at the same rates that millennials and Gen Z did. And so there is, of course, some fears around the privatization of education spaces and stuff like that people are ringing the alarm bells about. But I think it also signals a really important shift towards, like how can we disrupt different spaces and how can we redesign things in our likeness and in our best interests. And I think that Gen Z really did that, right? I think about my life online as a millennial, and then I look at the way that Gen Z did it, and it was completely different. And I think that part of it had to do with the fact that I grew up with dial-up internet, and I'm asking my parents for permission to have a MySpace page. It's very, very different, right? Growing up in that era than it is sort of in the era of just share whatever you want online and just make your whole life public. I see a lot of young people who get themselves into some pretty hot waters in that. And I think that, of course, Generation Alpha will learn from the trials and tribulations of Gen Z.
Sure. I'm thinking again back to the interview I did with Zach Gottlieb, in which I described the MySpace top friends. And I remember his eyes just widened. He was like, oh my gosh. He was like, and I thought the Snapchat top friends were bad, is basically was his reply. And it's interesting to reflect back then how, well, first of all, just as someone who is, no longer an adolescent, how non-serious it seems from with years of distance. But secondly, how that is still, what word am I looking for? It's so, it's almost unbelievable to think about, or even speaking of Snapchat, I remember that you used to be able to tell who other people's top friends were. So you could pretty much tell who people were hooking up with or dating, even if it was private. And then it was just out there for everyone to see. And they eventually got rid of that feature, I remember. But so weird, man.
It's
such a
so
weird,
strange. And it's so interesting just the ways that, so the way I understand it is a lot of these tech companies will just trial all these different features, and then they also steal and borrow a bunch of features from other apps that are working. And so it just becomes this big laboratory where they're just trying to see what works. They have tried all these features in many different formulas, and TikTok seems to be the one that consistently wins. They're the one that keep on, I think their platform is absolutely incredible. And unfortunately, I just think it causes so much dysregulation in young people.
So how do you see, so I don't primarily work with children or adolescents. I do work with a lot of young adults and people who are older, all the way up to senior citizens. What are you seeing clinically in terms of how technology is making its way into the therapy room, or the whether it's, do you see true mental health concerns of disordered behavior or thinking, or is it more kind of well, this is a new paradigm and this is a problem of living?
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting way of looking at it. I do think that it certainly does create new problems in living, for sure. And I think that there is almost a narcissistic level of self-focus that I am seeing. And I let out this big sigh because I'm I don't know what that looks like clinically and how that's going to show up, what the impacts of that are. But I'm also seeing conversely really low empathy, significant drops in empathy. And I think a lot of people, let's say teachers, doctors, that kind of thing, they like to talk about the pandemic as being a creator of that. But I'm seeing this problem well before the pandemic. And actually, if we sort of trace it back, we can If you follow the work of Jonathan Haidt out of NYU, he talks about how in around 2010 to 2012, we saw a really significant spike in the teen mental health crisis. And that was
Yeah.
around the time that the iPhone 4 was becoming the iPhone 5. And the major difference there was the introduction of the front-facing camera, which of course then enabled the development of all these photo sharing apps like Snapchat and Instagram. And so it sort of set the scene. It sort of set it ablaze a little bit. And so I'm noticing, and I try not to be an alarmist on this issue because I am a tech optimist. I think that tech is just such an important feature of our lives, and I really do wish to harness it for good. And at the same time, I've just seen so much evidence that I can't ignore and can't overlook when it comes to the maps around like the teen mental health crisis and stuff like that. So I think that Gen Z will have a lot to recover from. I do.
It is almost incomprehensible how not just how the iPhone changed culture, changed us as individuals, like changed the world in a lot of ways, but then it was the different features of the iPhone, like the front-facing camera. I mean, selfies were not a thing years ago. You know, you would have pictures of yourself, but you didn't necessarily take a selfie. It's a very, I mean, it's revelatory in its scope. I was struck by how you've noticed lack in empathy. Help me understand decreases in empathy. How might that be understood within the context of technology or smartphones or social media?
I think it's connected to the self-focus that we were talking about before. When you're just spending so much time focused on yourself, focused inward, you're not spending a lot of time in other focus, right? You're not spending a lot of other time taking perspective, looking at how must this be like for somebody. We're not mentalizing with other people. We're not wondering like, what is someone else's life like? And so the fascinating piece of that I find so interesting is that it's the most socially It's this most socially active, politically active generation. And I also find that this low empathy to be an interesting component of just showing up that way online. And it's almost as if like we are like brand managers for ourselves and not actually interested in like truly like from a compassionate perspective, like connecting with what it must be like for other people. And so I'm seeing like really rusty social skills, declines in separation and divorce, but at the same time, like not even having a really high tolerance for, you know, ruptures in relationships, like that type of thing.
Definitely. I'm thinking about where I felt it change because I'm a millennial, I'm 30, and I remember, I was a senior in college, and it was that freshman class. They came in, and I just remember being like, you're different. And it was specifically around the way a few of the freshmen who I interacted with talked about their brands. You know, it wasn't even necessarily that they were like entrepreneurial. It was more just, I mean, maybe they were, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm certainly entrepreneurial, but it was just this, it was more of an energy like in their being where they were very, very aware of how they appear, how they look, how it sounds, how they're dressing in a way that, I mean, every teenager and person in college, you know, is self-conscious and alienated from their body in some ways, and all of those things certainly are through lines. But I do remember thinking, I was like, oh, like something's different. I don't actually know how to speak to you, you know?
Yeah, totally. And my personal like take on that is that I think that we have almost become like avatars of ourselves. And that is sort of a feature of the dual immersion that I was talking about, that I think that we really do take interest in crafting this like online brand, this online persona, almost like we are mannequins, like trying on all this different stuff. And I just wonder if it's just a new developmental period of life for adulthood. Now that we have financial independence, now that, you know, we can kind of be out on our own, kind of doing our thing. I see a ton of people doing the try on. And I think in ways I've done it myself in many ways online. So it's fascinating to look at it from the outside.
Yeah. I had this interview with Colby Smith. He's a celebrity makeup artist, and he was saying that he has actually seen that in his industry, where the way he ideally practices like the artistry of makeup is to enhance your features so you look more like the best version of yourself. But he was saying that there's been this shift where it's like, well, now everyone wants to look like they have a face filter on all the time. And isn't that a bummer? Because that's not necessarily even like what everyone finds attractive. It may be nice to look at. And is it only nice to look at because we've been inundated with it through repetition? Or is it actually the aesthetic you're attracted to? Who's to say? It's very chicken or egg. But for him to say that, and I'm more just commenting on the parallel between what you're noticing as well, it's a little spooky.
That's so fascinating. I see, especially with the young girls that I work with, there's a really self-focused style of concern with appearance and body. But to Zach's point, I wonder if this is just sort of the reinvention of these same problems in a new generation. And it's another generation looking at it from the outside being like, whoa, that's weird. Whoa, that's different. We should be concerned about that. But I don't know. I think I'm kind of at the place where I'm not so convinced at this time that it's a problem for everybody, but I think that there are vulnerable people that will be impacted by it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with John Haidt's data on particularly amongst adolescent girls, but I know that it does span across the genders, and it's pretty concerning. It's not it's not like, oh, there's like a little uptick, like maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It's a very good research in terms of its objectivity. And I know that I'm certainly concerned about it. I want to go back to something you said earlier when you were saying how, the algorithms, the self-focus, it encourages certain types of thinking. You mentioned like black and white thinking and a few others. The question I have is the chicken or the egg. To what extent is the algorithm kind of shaping us slowly over time to think in these ways? And then to what extent are people who, like someone who struggles with black and white thinking, is going to more likely comment on someone's post because they're not looking at it in the nuance? And this is something that I see in my comment sections all the time because I create pretty nuanced content. I think that's one of the things that I'm known for. And it's fascinating to me that so often people listen to what I'm saying and they have such a complete different takeaway, where I might say, well, not everything bad that happens to you elicits a trauma response, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to say. And then the interpretation is something like, you just told me that my trauma doesn't exist, or you just told, or whatever it is. And it's just like, oh, like interesting. And it's, I've thought long and hard about this. And I mean, it feels, very like access to borderliney, like if I'm being totally honest, like the level of sensitivity and like the splitting, but it's very interesting to consider that it's not just that someone with that, what might I call it, like psychological constitution is more likely to comment. It's also that, and if you comment that way, because anyone can have a moment of black and white thinking, we all do when we're stressed or tired or activated from a post that really compelled us to feel a certain way, those comments are actually going to get more likes and more engagement. And in a way, I weirdly benefit from it in my nuanced content, which is a really weird thing to contend with because they're not actually agreeing or supporting with me. And yet their engagement is actually helping me get my message out there to people that do like it. And so it's a very complex and twisted, I don't know if twisted is quite the right word, but you get it. It's a weird phenomenon to just watch.
Yeah. And I think that the social media companies love this, right? This is the enragement gets engagement sort of system that they really profit from. And so they don't care what you're talking about. They don't care like what's in the comment section by and large. They're more kind of concerned like how much engagement, how many clicks, how many eyeballs are on this post or on this piece of media. And so I wonder just, you asked sort of a chicken or egg kind of question. And I think that the main things that I get concerned about as it comes to the algorithms is that I think it hacks our attention. It hacks into our stress system, and it also hacks our dopamine pathways. And I think that all those three together create a really big impact on the stress threat response, where we look and we're so hypervigilant to what threat is coming. Similar to like if we're like walking through a forest, it trains like a level of hypervigilance that I think is just like, unfortunately, so addictive, right? It keeps us coming back to it. And at the same time, like it can really repattern the way that we can self-regulate.
I want to draw what might seem to be a strange comparison to some of the topics, but I think the this kind of case example, if you will, might bring us insight into not only how to more deeply understand the problems that we're talking about, but also what we might do about it. And so I'm actually thinking about the gay community, and I'm thinking about the dating and hookup app Grindr, which has been on the scene for many years. And there's actually been a lot of really lovely research done on the app. And it actually, one of the studies I'm thinking about, it actually talks about, they didn't call it like dual immersion effect, but they talked about how there's kind of a different kind of sexual and romantic persona online versus like who you will be in person. And that led to all other sorts of studies and distinctions. Like there's this kind of like pornification of the dating culture, and it's a dating culture that rewards sexual novelty, and novelty is already an erotic driver for any human being, particularly men. I mean, maybe that's not actually quite right. Maybe there is a novelty mechanism within women as well. But all that to say is that you can take that community and you can actually almost model out, because I mean, Grindr came on the scene in the early 2000s. And so we've had like 20 years of it. And we're only like 5-10 years in to the algorithms operating as you've described them. And what we've seen, just kind of like anecdotally, like culturally, is you see there is on one hand, a certain percentage of people who, for whatever reason, engage with the culture as what is rewarded in the culture. So they are going to engage in certain dieting and exercise behaviors, and to look a certain way, and to get the rewards that this app, which is a central part of gay culture for many gay men, and they're going to go live their life like that. And then there's also like this camp of people who just can't take it anymore for whatever reason. Maybe it's for their mental health. Maybe they philosophically disagree. It doesn't matter, but they actually just opt off, right? And then there's this third group of people in which they, how would I say it? They make adjustments to the way they engage with the app to maximize the chances of them getting the goals they value. And so if what they value is maybe finding a romantic relationship, they kind of adjust their profile, they adjust how they use it in order to sift through all the noise, even though other people might be using it for different purposes. And I'm thinking about it in terms of, because it's a microcosm and it's a very specific example, but a very parallel example to some of what you're describing. And I guess I'm just wondering, A, what do you think of the comparison? And then B, we can do other slices of the interpretation, but thinking about how there are different people who will then start to kind of respond in different ways, and what might that mean for mental health, for therapy, for the things we've talked about, from the dual immersion effect, from increased self-concept, et cetera.
It's fascinating, right? I think that this is the bubble filter thing I was talking about, right? Yeah. Where we're setting a new system of operation for a group of people, or that group of people is also just sort of screaming into the void at the same group of people. And so I think that, it creates new in-group norms. It resets new ways of doing, new ways of being, new ways of thinking, new ways of feeling. And it absolutely impacts culture and impacts the ways that we relate to one another too. And I think that the other thing that I was really sort of tuned into as you were talking is that it really resets our ability to signal or to like send off different signals to other people. And so the signals that we see in ourselves may not be so identifiable within us, but then also we look at other people and we're like, oh, I don't really connect with that. And where I think identity labels have served us in the past is that it's been able to offer a bit of a bridge of connection between different groups, right? But I think the algorithms really do like throw a wrench in that, because they have the ability to reset the norms like I was talking about. And so when norms are renormed and renormed again and again and again, that makes for a really difficult climb, really difficult to keep up with what is trending, what is in, what is sexy, what is, attractive, that kind of thing.
What do you mean? I didn't quite follow. What do you mean by picking up on signals in yourself versus others? Can you say a couple more things about that?
Kind of like, what are the new in-group rules? What are the new signals that I signal to other people to say I'm part of this group?
Yeah.
And so I think before, like when we were just living our lives offline, there were certain ways of doing that, right? It could be like the job that we had, it could be sort of the group membership that we were a part of. We had different ways of kind of communicating to the world who we are. A lot of that, of course, is done at work. A lot of it is done in like at bars and at libraries and in the park. And with the erosion of third spaces, I think that the new third space, which is not home and which is not work/school, is the internet. The internet is the new third space, and in the new third space, there are many different in groups and many different filters of people, and within each of those filters, there's different signs and signals that we use to communicate or signal our membership to that group.
It's super interesting. The thing that came up for me is the really incredible diversity of responses to October 7th and what happened in Israel. And one of the reflections I've had about that event, particularly as it relates to identity, as you're talking about, is before you could safely assume someone's values, someone's politics, and someone's world outlook based on identity. For the most part. And it's not that there were never exceptions, but you could do it pretty well. And it feels like that norm, that way of being, was just completely obliterated. That you actually just don't know and you can't know. And in a way, maybe the reason why the internet is such an insufficient third space, as you were referring to it, is because it's actually too big of a room.
Like, it's way too big. Yeah. Yeah.
It's too big. And so you get to talk, and it's an incredible tool in some ways, but sometimes I'm looking at who's commenting or interacting with my content, and it's truthfully people of every walk of life all over the world. And there is something really, really amazing about that. But then the downside that I'm hearing you say is but there's something incredibly destabilizing, because no matter how novelty seeking your temperament might be, you need some instances of permanence. I mean, that's what culture is. It's to provide norms and institutions so you can navigate the world in a semi-predictable way. But what I hear you say is that the more social media influences the internet, which is pop culture in so many ways, the higher the likelihood is it can change just like on a dime. I'm thinking about my most viral video, and I've talked about this a little bit before, but I really didn't want to make content before I first started. People would ask me like, why don't you make content, Joe? And I would say, 'cause cringe. I was like, 'cause I do not want to do that. And I had an early video that did very well. The one about trauma, where I criticized the misuse of trauma discourse. It's still pinned to the top of my page. It has like 5.5 or 6 million views. Watching it not just go viral and reach the millions of people it reached, but then watching other content creators make their own versions of it. And sometimes it was a stitch, like agreeing or disagreeing, but then other times they're not referring to me, but they're doing like the same talking point, if you will. And you just know their social media manager was like, check out what this guy did. Like, this really resonated. And you can't even calculate the amount of people that reached. And I guess I bring it up to say that, I mean, well, number one, I don't cringe anymore. It's a very, very powerful and potent tool. But number two, trauma is being talked about one way, completely normalized one way. And then one video or a group of videos ends up kind of, and then you see, and I have noticed, I actually have even content creators I have criticized for their misuse are much more careful with their language, which is a good thing. I do agree with that change, but it's more about using this story to highlight what we were just talking about, which is you renorm, you renorm, you renorm. That's pretty anxiety inducing.
And destabilizing, to your earlier point about predictability, right? There's so much uncertainty and ambiguity that comes up when you're like, okay, wait, what's trending? What are the norms of the space? And you're right. I think it's way too big of a room to set a consistent norm that is going to stay put.
Yeah. How do all of these topics, all of this insight, this whole conversation, how does it show up for you as a practitioner in the way that you show up for your patients? As we get towards the end here, I would love to, if we can, empower people who are listening to think about these things in an intentional way, specifically as it relates to their mental health.
I would say that I have really, more than ever, of course, we know this is very important. The relationship is the number one predictor of success in therapy. But now more than ever, I really take that just so seriously, to the point where I now have started to identify myself as a relational psychotherapist, because I really do feel like the relational components of therapy and therapeutic spaces are also eroding as a result of social media. And I think that many people are kind of drawn to self-help or wellness content, and they feel as though, oh, this is the replacement for therapy. This is therapy.
Yeah.
And I feel strongly about pushing back on that as a way of suggesting that we need to really preserve the profession of psychotherapy for obvious reasons. But self-help content is not a replacement for meaningful psychotherapy. And so personally, the way that I do that is I show up with intention online, and I show up with intention in my real life too. And I, similar to you, I also didn't come to the space being like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to be an influencer. I'm going to be a mental health content creator. But I, over time, as I was sort of publishing and posting stuff online, I fell into it quite honestly, because I would rather show up than be completely out of the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. The comment on this is not a replacement. It's one of those things where I notice people in my life. I don't really notice it as much as patients, but they are in therapy with me and I am treating them. So it doesn't necessarily apply to that group, but I notice it with people in my life where they'll say, I might make that comment. It's like, well, it's no replacement for good therapy. And they go, oh, well, I know. And I get curious. I go, well, is it that you know and you're just not ready to go to therapy? Or maybe you can't find a therapist, maybe you can't afford a therapist. I mean, there's so many reasons why someone isn't in therapy, and I'm not knocking anyone for that, but it's just enough of a dopamine hit to make you feel like you are improving in some direction. But my experience, and because I didn't absorb a ton of self-help content before I started creating it, my experience of absorbing it has actually been, if I just think about the posts that I really like, the distinctions that are new to me and meaningful and really, really smart and really, really, really well done, the biggest issue for me is there's actually too many of them. Mm-hmm. There's way too much good content out there that I actually can't integrate it, not if I wasn't in therapy, which I am right now. And as you know, and as you appreciate, it's the quality of the relationship. And I think one of the things that makes the relationship work is the patience that we provide our patients, not to sound overly wordy, our clients. Because change is, I was shocked by that because I read about it in school, but when I went into my practicum and internship, I was, they talk about the rush to restore and all that stuff, but I was absolutely shocked at how slow it was and how it needed that pace, because too much change, to your point, it's destabilizing.
Yeah, it's necessarily slow, and by design it's slow. And I think that social media is the exact opposite, right? It sort of trains this urgency and availability, which almost sort of suggests or implies that the faster I consume this content, the better I'll be in my life. And unfortunately, that just makes you more distracted and more addicted to the platform. It doesn't actually help in a meaningful way.
Yeah. I think that's a way that the algorithm has potentially affected me personally, which is, and it's more than one thing, right? Because I'm a super type A person. I live in Manhattan, so there's already kind of this urgent energy. And now I monitor social media all the time, and I do catch myself sometimes, whether it's with a romantic interest or a friend or something in business, this impatience where I'm kind of like, I need it now. Mm-hmm. I need to know right now, and that is literally just not how most things work.
Totally. Even if we just zoom out from the social media impacts of that, I do think that there's an Amazon effect to that. There's the Tinder effect to that. There's the Uber effect. Everything is right there, right? It's so available. And I think meaningful relationships are not that way. They're not always available. And that's why I think, clinically, the way that I practice, I think it's becoming a lot more old school. I'm kind of going back to the roots of psychotherapy, because I feel like a lot of the modern psychotherapy components and pieces, I'm just kind of not really that into. So I'm kind of, I'm going back.
Yeah. What exactly are you going back to? You talked about the relationship. Do you identify as more humanistic, or what what is it that you're going back to?
You know what? I've recently just been doing a ton of deep dive training on psychodynamic psychotherapy and psychoanalytic work. Coming back to the origins of the profession, just looking at like, okay, what are the meaningful forms of change work and psychotherapeutic change? And so I'm finding myself like really gravitated to, some of the more contemporary kind of pieces too. Like I really value the more relational approaches. And, compassion-based frameworks and attachment-based frameworks, just because of the population that I work with, the more developmental frameworks. But overall, I would say that I think that I'm just really not into the McDonaldization of therapy. And I don't want it to just be like really solution-focused brief therapies that are like, hey, like let's do 6 sessions and get you in and out. I just want to do like the more deeper long-term work.
Yeah, absolutely. I was trained psychodynamically. I identify as an integrative practitioner. I find that I can veer more cognitive behavioral or more psychodynamic depending on the case. Different people need a different approach. I personally have been loving the practicing the somatic therapies and just kind of helping people with that catharsis and that mindfulness. It's been very rewarding.
So good. So good. Yeah. Love somatic psychotherapy too.
Yeah,
it's good stuff.
One of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking is, how do I want to say it? So when I'm working with people, it has not been till quite recently. I've been making content for like 9 months ish. It wasn't until very, very recently that, patients who did not find me on social media, who I've been working with for a very, very long time, my videos have started to kind of creep onto their feeds. And of course, they watch one, the algorithm starts blasting them with me. And I was just wondering, just because you're also a content creator, also a practitioner, is that something that you've dealt with any of the teenagers or kids that you treat? And if so, like, how does that come up for you?
Yeah, you know what? I'm like right in it with the kids that I work with. They look me up. I have very strict social media and electronic communication policies for this reason. But yeah, I actually tend to not accept clients who find me on social media. I find that they are a style of client or a brand of client that I find myself not enjoying working with as much as the people who are more sort of community based, who are sort of close to me, close to my practice, close to my clinic. And so I prefer working in person. So there's just a lot of layers to it. But overall, I have seen the impacts of it, and I have worked with a lot of clients who have found me via social media. And I think I've done great work with them, but I don't tend to lean towards that population.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I'm completely virtual as of right now. I'm potentially going back in person part-time later in the year. And so for me, it doesn't really matter. I personally haven't noticed a difference of feel, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, of course.
Between people who have or haven't. But one of the ways I manage that boundary, and this is exactly what I say to them if they end up seeing my videos or they find me through my videos, is I say, listen, you will notice that there is not a booking link on my media website or on my Joe Nucci Therapy Instagram. And I do that. There's legal coverage just for liability, et cetera. But it's like, this is separate. And when I say this isn't therapy, that is literally what I mean. This isn't like a thing I'm putting like just for the liability. I mean, that obviously matters. And I do use disclaimers and stuff like that just for more common sense purposes. But it's interesting that no matter how many disclaimers I put saying that if you reach out via these channels for clinical services, like your message will be deleted.
Yeah.
Like your comment will not be replied to in a serious way. And people don't necessarily read it, or they figure, it can't hurt to risk. And it doesn't affect me either way, but it is just very interesting to the people who I have worked with who then actually work with me. What a lot of them have said, I don't think all of them, because we don't really talk about it, but a lot of them who kind of do the work and like Google and like find me and like email my practice email or like whatever, it's been this interesting trend where a lot of them say like, I actually like unfollowed you.
Yeah.
And it's not because your content isn't great, you know what I mean? But I was just like, no, like that actually makes a ton of sense to me that you would do that.
I've had that too, for sure, for sure. Yeah. And but I invite it into the therapy room. I invite it into conversation. I think there are some clinicians who get very strictly boundaried around it, and they kind of are like, don't follow me, don't look at me, don't follow my stuff, which algorithmically can be so impossible, right? To like really even when you mandate like the no follow policy, like the algorithm will still push you stuff through the discovery graph. So sometimes there is no escaping it fully.
As we near the end here, what are some things that you want the listeners to really remember from the conversation? I mean, I really enjoyed talking to you, and your knowledge of technology, and then the thoughts about culture, and then like connecting it back to like the individual has just been really, really quite stimulating. But there's also like a lot there. And so as we get towards the end, what are some key takeaways, or you things that you hope people remember, whether or not they agree, that you hope they think about?
For me, I would sort of sum it up from the perspective of, I think that we are really impacted by the technologies that we interface with every day. And I think previously the way that we've thought about it is through the lens of nature and nurture, the way that our environment kind of impacts us. But unfortunately, that formula doesn't really apply here. And so I think that there is a third one, which I would suggest is numerics. I think that when the algorithms and the way that numbers and binary sets of numbers and systems kind of really impact how we show up and how we relate and how we think and how we feel and how we can connect with each other. I think we're in a new era of nature versus nurture versus numerics that I think will be at the forefront of new conversations about technology as it impacts well-being. And so I think that with the future, we are just so wise to remember, like at our core, we are not robots. Although I think that robots can help supplement our lives super well, the phone, I think, in a way, could be seen as a third body part, right? That really impacts our ability to connect and use the built-in capacities of our nervous system and our brain to be able to show up and enable our social relationships and therefore our mental health and development. So I think I just want to remind people that we are human, and necessarily so.
It's beautiful. It reminds me of this quote. I think it might be the sociobiologist, E.O. Wilson, who said something like, the dilemma of our time, which is something that we talked a lot about today, is that we have basically like ancient limbic systems, ancient nervous systems. We have medieval institutions, and we have absolute godlike technology.
Wow.
And really understanding, it's not even that we need to necessarily bring them all into alignment, but we need to be aware that they're not in alignment in order to move forward.
Wow, Joe, that's huge. Thank you for sharing that with me. I hadn't heard that one before, but I think it's so true. Yeah,
absolutely. With that said, thank you so much for joining in the conversation. If you liked what you heard, please, you can go follow my page at Joe Nucci Therapy. Jake, would you remind me of what your handle is? How can people find you?
Yeah, people can get in touch with me at MSWJake, and they can also listen to my podcast, appropriately titled This Isn't Therapy.
I love it. I love it. Well, we have to have you back and continue some of this conversation, maybe even on your podcast if you'd like to. Luminaries Therapy versus the World is available on Spotify, on YouTube, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And remember, if you want to listen to it early and ad-free, please consider subscribing to Luminary.